Rewritten! Epilogue! Mr. Argus was delighted to see the progress on his nose and his hands. He was equally proud to show her all of it, too, able to prove for certain this time that it was possible to get better. The return of most of Stephen's hands was making things easier. He could hold things now, really hold them with limbs that were meant to do so. Even though the claws were still pretty big, the changes in his fingers and his thumb were what really counted. His hands hurt less, too. Where the scales had disappeared, the pain had too. His knuckles still felt dry and crusty, but the palms of his hands were fleshy again, the bends in his fingers not nearly as swollen. He could hold his phone again without balancing it awkwardly on his pads. He could text Connie and call her without misclicking 5 times. He could hold spoons and forks and knives and eat without help. He could open doors, he could turn pages in books, he could write with pencils, he could open his pill bottles, he could touch people without the fear of scratching them. Stephen would have never guessed that he'd get to a point in his life where all of those things were wonderful accomplishments, but here he was. Stephen just wished that it would happen to the rest of him. But for now, he just let himself be relieved. Life was beginning to become livable. Days passed, then weeks, then months, and things were getting better, slowly. Stephen still had days that were worse than others. Some days, despite the return of most of his hands, he'd be so overwhelmed with the rest of his scars that almost nothing could calm him down. Those days, he woke up with the same feelings of dread and emptiness that he'd been hoping to leave behind, and those feelings would stay with him for no particular reason other than to make him feel horrible. Some days, it didn't matter what he did, he couldn't get away from memories from his past, haunted and paranoid even with everyone else telling him that he was okay. But those days weren't enough to stop him permanently. He survived every one of them, no matter how hard it was, and his family was caring for him the best that they could to help him through the worst times. There was no shortcut to healing. Life was going to be hard on him, harder than it ever had been before. But that didn't mean that he was going to let it get the better of him. No matter what happened, Stephen knew that he was going to get better eventually. The only way for the butterflies to win would be if he listened to them. His gem was speaking to him less and less. He could feel its emotions closer to his, the control more unified. Mr. Argus said that the goal for him and his gem was to get back to the point that they were at before they were separated by White. Their bodies were fused, but their minds weren't yet. Stephen and his gem needed to become the same person again. And they were, gradually. One day they would get there. One day they would be whole. Stephen's scars were showing improvement too as the months dragged on, though it was a painstakingly slow process. The rest of the healing was less abrupt than his nose and hands. One day a scale or two would go missing, another his horns would shorten by a centimeter. Most of the time nothing would change at all, and he would worry that this was as good as it was going to get. But inch by inch, Stephen was recovering. It was taking a lot of effort, care, and patience, but he was getting there. He was beginning to feel a little more normal with every scale that he lost. By the next year, Stephen had almost 1/3 of his scars gone. His fangs had shrank enough so most of them actually fit into his mouth now, leaving only 2 sharp teeth poking up from his bottom lip. His teeth were still pointy, but they weren't trying to stab their way out of his jaw now. His feet had returned to a more human shape, the claws shrinking and the skin replaced most of the scales, meaning that his feet actually fit in shoes now. His tusks were almost gone, only 2 little spikes on his cheeks, and his face was now mostly scaleless, other than the stubborn patch around his eyes. His bat-like ears were shriveling up a little, not flopping around awkwardly nearly as much, though they were still pointed and twitchy. His horns were half their original height, and the quills that had popped up from his back and crested his shoulders were shortening too. His hands had stayed mostly the same, but he was just glad that they weren't being taken away again. It all felt so much better. He could walk for longer without help, though he still needed to hand down the stairs. His scars still hurt, but it was much preferred to how he started out. The scars weren't the only thing that was improving about him. They couldn't reduce without his mind getting better, of course. Stephen would never truly get away from depression and anxiety, but the symptoms were becoming a little more manageable. He knew what to do whenever they came up. He knew how to keep his head when a panic attack threatened to escalate a perfectly harmless situation. Miss Argus had been helping him, through more focused sessions, to lessen the fears and flashbacks that came from his CPTSD. They were working on the more prominent experiences, and through controlled experiments, they were able to get him more used to the triggering movements or people or places. Stephen was getting much better at restraining his gem, passing on the information that it was okay and that it didn't have to attack anymore. Anger management was getting easier too. It was on the same line as preventing panic attacks, but dealt with instead just making sure neither he nor his gem reacted to any violently defensive thoughts he got. Stephen had counted to 10 more times than he ever needed to, but it was really helping him keep his head. And since he was now more in control, that meant that they were ready to let him re-enter society. Well, not really. The ban was still up, but his family had asked for them to let Stephen start going to school. Greg had said that Stephen had spent his whole life trying to be a gem, so now they were going to let him be a human. And being human meant getting an education, just as all the other children had his age. It wasn't easy to convince Beach City schools to take him. Stephen and his dad went through a lot of meetings between the principals and whoever the principal's boss was called. They all wanted to make sure that he wasn't a danger to the other students. Stephen was sure that he wasn't, although all the adults weren't there to see that. They were able to assure them that Stephen had gotten down from being dangerous to other people. That was the first and most important thing that him and Miss Regus had focused on, stopping the aggressive reactions from his gem. Since he was half diamond, his outburst meant more than just yelling or slamming a door, so Miss Regus had been quick to quiet down any defensive outward reflexes he'd developed from fighting his whole childhood. Now, Stephen was mostly left with problems that really only bothered himself, but at least he'd learned how to stop it from hurting other people. Once the adults were sure that Stephen wasn't as dangerously unstable as all the rumors made him out to be, they reluctantly agreed to let him attend once the school year started up again. Stephen had apparently delayed school for almost a whole year due to his corruption. The last school year pretty much didn't even start at all, with so many homes destroyed. They were just trying to forget that last school year even happened, starting again with this year. Stephen was going to discover very soon why Connie and Lars and Sadie and pretty much every other human that he knew hated school. When Stephen was a kid, he remembered how he'd wanted to go to school like Connie since it seemed fun. He'd never been around the other kids his age, and he was left alone by the crystal gems for days on end, so he supposed there was no reason that they would miss him. But his dad had insisted to never let him go to school because he was worried that they might find out about his magic heritage and steal him away for experiments or something. Of course, that was way before Stephen learned how he was a diamond and saved the world, so since everything was out in the open now, they now trusted that no crazy government spies would snatch Stephen up, not with the looming threat of his godlike grandparents. The only catch was that Stephen needed to take a sort of entrance exam to test and see how far up the grade level he would be placed at. So, to prepare, Stephen and Connie had studied together for months in advance, covering everything that Stephen would need to know to catch up. They were aiming to, at least, get him up to high school. Though he would have been a sophomore or a senior if he had a normal childhood, they weren't expecting to make it that high, only wanting to skip elementary and middle school. "What's wrong with middle school?" Stephen had asked over the phone. He'd only really been focusing on not being a kindergartner, but Connie had insisted to try and skip middle school too. "Trust me, you don't want to know," Connie had replied, dread in her tone. "It's a trash fire of puberty and acne and hormones in there." He'd heard that middle schoolers were aged from about 11 to 14, and when he was 14, he saved Homeworld from White Diamond's tyrannical rule, so he assumed that they were all as sensible and well-adjusted as he had been. But judging by Connie's warnings of doom, he was beginning to think that that was not the case. Connie drilled him on complicated math equations, dates of historical events, grammar and spelling, biology and chemistry, and about 100 of other things that he wasn't sure he'd ever actually need. Stephen had lived his whole life not needing to know how to do long division, but he guessed that if Connie said that if he needed to do that, he did. Even though it was all confusing and difficult and frustrating at best, Connie at least tried to make it interesting. They had their own study hours in the morning and the evening, and with Connie's direction, Stephen was absorbing the material as fast as he could. After going over and memorizing mountains of seemingly useless information, Stephen managed to pass the exam they gave him well enough to make it into 9th grade. He'd wanted to at least get into the double digits, but Connie had reassured him that it was probably best to start there, and that at least he didn't have to deal with middle school classmates. It turned out that getting in was the easy part, and that not a single human that he'd talked to was being too negative whenever they described school. Stephen's first day was rough, much rougher than he'd expected, and he expected it to be bad already. He wasn't really bullied, but he certainly wasn't welcome. The instant that he walked through the doors, he was singled out of the crowd, avoided like he carried a disease. Everyone knew who he was, and even though his scars were better than they started, they were still painfully obvious, like a smear of ketchup on a clean white shirt. Everyone gave the freaky, half-alien lizard kid a wide berth, staring and whispering and sliding away. The walk to first period felt just as exposing whenever he'd gone to Homeworld to reason with Bluebird, Holly, and Curly. When he made it to the right class, mostly everyone was already there, and he ended up startling the teacher as he came in. "Oh! Sorry, you spooked me." She tried to recover, clearly attempting to act like nothing was wrong, even though her eyes kept flicking over his horns and fangs and spikes and talons. He didn't blame her. She'd known that he would be in her class, but there was nothing that she could do to prepare herself to see his disfigured face. Stephen managed to stand out in almost every way possible. On top of all of his other oddities, Stephen was also the oldest and biggest in his class. All of the kids around him were about 13, while he had just turned 18. He was very, very out of place in this pod of nervous, staring humans. It felt like he was the heavy side of a scale, like the room was slowly tilting towards him like it was balanced on an uneven table leg. When he sat down at the back corner, hopefully making it harder for people to stare at him, he could tell that he'd caused a silence. He pretended not to notice the kid in front of him, trying to sneakily scoot his chair a little farther from his. The only person that was staring was to his right, though her expression seemed to be made up more of pity than fearful shock. Stephen could already tell that this was going to be a bad day. "Good morning, class," the teacher began at the front, next to the whiteboard. "My name is Miss Flares, and I'll be your biology teacher for this year." Stephen looked up, glad that the attention was on Miss Flares now instead of him. "Until," she said, "I want to start off the year with some icebreakers, so as I call roll, I'd like you to tell us something that you did over the extended summer." It felt like the air was stolen right from his lungs. He was a little too stunned to process what that meant as the teacher pulled up the roster on her computer and called, "Haley Brown?" He watched as a red-haired girl, a few rows in front of him, said, "Here, over the summer I went to my grandpa's ranch for a family trip." The teacher nodded politely and went on to the next name, which he didn't hear. Stephen's thoughts staggered around in his head in confusion. What did he do over the summer? What was he supposed to say? "Over the summer I murdered someone. Over the summer I was almost publicly assassinated. Over the summer I corrupted into a giant Godzilla monster. Over the summer I morbidly tried to drown myself in my own mom's tears. Over the summer I went to therapy." He didn't think that any of those were good options. Stephen had a sinking feeling that this icebreaker was designed without him in mind. But still, the teacher was going down the list, and the U's were approaching fast. He had to think of something. Stephen tried to think of good things that happened to him. "I made up with my girlfriend? No, that was too personal. I helped eyeball out of a toxic relationship? Also, no. I regained my will to live? Absolutely not." And then, aloud, he heard the teacher call, "Steven Universe?" Oh no. Everyone was looking at him again. Miss Flares was clearly trying to act like he was any other kid, but he could see the doubtful regret in her expression whenever she realized what he had to say to participate. The silence was painful. Why couldn't she just mark him down as present and move on? He was obviously here. Nobody could miss him. Stephen forced himself to cough up some sort of answer, knowing that he would only make a bigger scene if he waited any longer. "Here." Oh no, his voice cracked. Did he sound unstable? Did they think he was crazy? Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Over the summer, I spent time with my dad, I guess." Stephen finally managed with a relieved breath. Whatever genius brain cell that thought of that idea was currently being awarded Medal of Honor in his head. It was vague and normal. Nothing to ask questions about. "What else?" The whole room jumped as a kid near the middle leaped up, slamming his palms on his desk while the kids around him stared in alarm. Stephen froze, trying not to turn pink, since that would be a spectacle they'd all remember and freak out even more about. He squeaked out in confusion, "Uh-huh." The kid looked furious, his dark hair sticking up, green eyes acidic. He yelled, "What else did you do? Go on, tell us!" Stephen didn't know what to do. He was stuck stammering startled phrases. Well, I..." Before a kid sitting next to the angry one grabbed his arm and tried to pull him down like he was a hot air balloon trying to soar away in a hurricane. "Devin, stop! Just let it go!" The other kid, the one trying to restrain Devin, was casting terrified looks in Stephen's direction like he expected for him to lunge at Devin. In fact, Stephen noticed he had the same hair, the same eyes. The two were probably brothers. "No!" Devin snarled. "He knows what he did, and he won't even say it!" Stephen knew that he'd destroyed a lot of homes as a monster. It didn't take long for him to make the connection that one of those homes must have been Devin's. I'm sorry," Stephen yelped, struggling to keep his gem from glowing in defense. "It's kind of... I don't really want to... I wasn't..." Devin looked like he was going to explode, yelling, "Say it! Come on, say it! Say what you did!" "Devin, that is quite enough! Sit down!" Miss Flares finally spoke up, just as the brother managed to drag Devin into his seat again, hissing frantic, scolding words to him. His brother addressed Stephen with, I'm so sorry about him. He's thinking of another guy. Please don't hurt him." Stephen was even more taken aback at that. The brother wasn't stopping Devin because he felt bad for Stephen. He was afraid of Stephen attacking Devin. The guilt that came from that realization made him want to claw his scales off one by one. Were they all like that? He searched their faces and found similar terrified looks on each of them. They thought that they were stuck in a class with a serial killer. Even though Devin had stopped shouting, Stephen was still very shaken up. He kept his eyes on his desk, decidedly not crying, and just wished that they would stop staring at him. The whole room felt tight and hot, like an oven with all of them stuffed inside. Even the continuation of the roll call wouldn't get rid of the stone that was lodged in Stephen's throat. The teacher tried to go on with the period, but had been so thoroughly ruined already that relief only came when the bell rang. Stephen made sure to be the last one out, even though he needed more time to walk to the next class with his heavy corruption scars. He didn't want any chances of getting in Devin's way. The teacher asked him if he was okay whenever he finally left, and Stephen nodded hurriedly. He didn't want to spend his first day here in the counselor's office. He just had to get through this, to at least know how school worked before figuring out how to be stable here. Most of the other teachers were doing similar icebreaker questions, which he replied as vaguely as he did for the first time. For interesting facts about himself, he'd replace "I'm half alien" with "I can play the guitar." For things that he did over the summer, he replaced "almost killed you all" with "hung out with my family." Luckily, those answers worked for the rest of the day, and no more Devin-like instances occurred. He made it through second period, third period, fourth period, and then finally landed on lunch. Lunch seemed to be fated to be as awkwardly stiff as class had been. As he walked in, the other students mysteriously seemed to run out of space all around them, moving closer to friends or spreading bags over empty spaces between them. Knowing their intentions, he tried to walk past them without looking like some lost dog, finding a spot in a vacant corner that nobody seemed interested in. He pulled out the bag lunch that he'd brought from home and just tried to look as non-threatening as possible as he ate. Nobody wandered over to sit with him, even whenever it became crowded at the other tables. Stephen tried to remind himself that the others' reluctant avoidance of him was understandable, especially since the rumors about him made him out to be some deadly, half-corrupted lunatic. And besides, he looked the farthest from approachable with his spikes and scales and fangs. Most of them were probably too afraid to risk getting close. He sat through lunch in lonely silence, finishing up his food. Stephen tried to imagine that Connie was sitting with him, or his dad, or Garnet, Amethyst, and Pearl, and then he tried to imagine that he wasn't in school at all and that they were all peacefully eating lunch at home. That helped for a while, but the illusion broke when Stephen looked up and saw Devin glaring at him sharply from 2 tables away. He winced and kept his eyes on his fists, wishing that he could properly apologize to him. Not just to him, every kid whose year was wrecked by him. 5th period, 6th period, 7th period, and 8th period scraped along like a wheelless car being towed out of the street. Stephen unfortunately had Devin in 7th too, but his brother was there to make sure that Devin didn't try anything. He was worried that Devin would try to jump him, not just because he was scared of getting hurt, but because he was scared of how his gem would react. He'd been managing its overreactions well so far, but he hasn't been put up to the test in a real fight yet. His gem might forget everything that it's been learning about restraint and seriously hurt Devin. The poor kid would have had his home destroyed as well as half of his bones if he even survived at all. Stephen wished that he could warn Devin about that without making it sound like a threat. Saying, "If you fight me, you could literally die," was the farthest thing from a friendly reminder. After one last particularly rough class where the teacher seemed determined to ask as many questions as possible about his corruption scars, Stephen was free. He got home feeling like a pile of radioactive waste. Stephen was able to talk to his dad and Connie about it, which made him feel a little better, but he still didn't feel ready for the next day. Things were mostly the same on Tuesday, except that this time he was pretty sure a few kids were missing from class. He didn't think much of it at first, occupied of surviving until 8th period. Devin sent him death glares that he pretended not to notice, but luckily didn't cause another scene. Stephen did the best that he could to withstand the staring. It was like they couldn't look away, like he was some gory car crash. The more rushed teachers began teaching the basics of their curriculum, but some were still going slowly. He tried to concentrate on what the teacher was saying, but it was hard whenever kids kept sneaking glances back to get another look whenever they thought that he wouldn't notice. He stayed still and unguarded for them, a part of him hoping that they would see that he's not as scary as the gossip says that he is, even though Stephen really just wanted to sink down into the ground until he was able to hide from it all. His gem didn't like their stares, and he spent most of his energy keeping himself calm. Having a panic attack in the middle of class would be a nightmare. So far, he hasn't freaked out yet, but Stephen was getting the sense that it wouldn't be long before he snapped. When lunch came around, Stephen crawled off to his corner alone, wishing that either the other students would get used to him or he would get used to their curiously disgusted expressions. Stephen was expecting for lunch to go the same way that it had all yesterday, so he was very surprised whenever somebody walked up to him and sat down a few inches away. He froze, not even looking up at them, wondering why they were sitting there and what they wanted, and if maybe it was some sort of dare from the other students to see if they would touch his gross scales for $5. "Hey," her voice shot through his swirling thoughts like a bullet. "Stephen, right?" He nearly choked. What? Why was she doing that? Why was she trying to introduce herself? Who talked her into this? Unfortunately, he mumbled, not really knowing how to react. "Well, I'm Emma. Nice to meet you," she chirped. Stephen decided that he should make eye contact before it comes off as rude, and looked up at her. She was tall for a 9th grader, with short-cut sandy blonde hair. He recognized her to be the girl in first period that sat next to him, the one that had looked at him like he was a puppy with a broken leg. Was that what this was? Maybe she just felt bad for him. Maybe she felt obligated to be his friend. That felt a little wrong, like maybe he was tricking her into this. But then again, nobody else had tried to civilly speak with him before her, and her smile was wide and welcoming, like she genuinely wanted to talk to him. Why are you here?" he asked slowly, his words feeling clumsy. "Why are you here?" she bounced back. "You're all alone." Stephen shrugged. I don't know. I don't think anyone else really wants to talk to me, so I just wanted to respect their boundaries and stuff." He hated how his sentences were coming out. He remembered how he used to be so talkative and extroverted whenever he was younger, able to make friends left and right and pick up a fun conversation with anyone. Now, after everything that happened to him, it seemed like he had completely lost that ability. He didn't like that. It was yet another thing that all of his issues were taking away from him. He'd just never discovered it before now, since all he had to talk to was his close family and Miss Ragoose. "Why wouldn't they want to talk to you?" Emma asked. "You saved all their butts like 1,000,000 times." Stephen sighed and muttered, "Yeah, when I was like 14. "I'm 14, Emma protested, grinning, "and the most heroic thing I've done is save snails from the driveway. You're awesome!" Stephen gave her a half-hearted smile, knowing that she was at least trying. But all that made him wonder, she just wanted to talk to 14-year-old savior of the galaxy Stephen instead of 18-year-old anxiety-ridden, PTSD-ruined, depression-drowned Stephen. Before he could ride that train of thought too far, she said, "But that shouldn't even matter anyway. Your life is obviously really tough, and I, for one, am not planning to make it any tougher. And besides, you're easier to talk to than anyone else here, and I honestly thought that I would make a friend before now, so since we are both in need of friendship, can I stick by you for now?" Stephen blinked at her as she gave him a sparkling smile. Emma was strange, but not any stranger than he was. So he nodded and replied with, Yeah, sure." And with that, he found at least one good thing about school. Emma talked a lot about almost everything, from bad math grades to a pet that she had a few years ago to a pretty necklace that she got for her girlfriend. This sometimes distracted him from all the messed up stuff in his life. When he tried to speak, she always shut her mouth and listened with all of her attention, taking in every word like she really liked hearing what he had to say. Her optimistic cheer was a good contrast to the dark, gloomy claustrophobia that came from being in school, making all of it seem a little more bearable. His dad was glad to hear that he'd made a friend and said that it was one of the keys to surviving school. Stephen knew that his dad had been concerned about how Stephen would react to being put through school in his state, and he seemed a little more calm after hearing that at least he wasn't outcasted from everyone. But Emma wasn't there all the time. Just as Stephen had been worried about, he soon found it hard to keep up with the lessons. Weeks began to drag by, a droning of information that was being force-fed into him and then spat back out on a Friday test. Some teachers were better and slower, but 3rd period, 4th, and 8th were especially horrible. 3rd period's teacher, Miss Taylor, didn't seem very aware of how much she drew attention to him whenever she stared at him from her desk for the entire 45 minutes he had to withstand her class. It made his spikes bristle up, his gem expecting an attack, and he'd spend an unnecessary amount of time calming down just because of it. 4th period's teacher, Mr. Johnson, seemed to be one of those people who thought that mental illness was exaggerated bullcrap from overdramatic wimps, and although he never outright argued with Stephen about it, he clearly seemed to think that Stephen somehow deserved the painful corruption scars that had infected him, as if he had put them there for attention and was now paying for it. 8th period's teacher, Miss Smith, saw him as a poor, helpless infant and was very loud about it. She was the only teacher to scream like his head was chopped off whenever she saw him the first time, before fussing over if he was feeling okay or if he needed any help. It was embarrassing, even though her intentions were good, because it just brought more attention to himself whenever she really couldn't do anything about this, since she was just not qualified. But it wouldn't matter if Miss Taylor kept her stare away, or if Mr. Johnson stopped rolling his eyes every time Stephen winced, or if Miss Smith would leave him alone. He was still having a hard time adjusting to all of this. Stephen was just plain having trouble paying attention with all the noise already occupying his brain space. One particularly horrible day, he wasn't able to hold his ground. Stephen came into class already tired out from a nightmare, and then he was thinking so much about the newly surfaced memory that he had to wind himself down before a flashback sent him into a panic. And then he realized that the teacher had called on him and he answered wrong, and now he was worrying about everyone thinking that he's an idiot and Emma thinking that he's an idiot, and then, poof, he has to finish an assignment by the end of the day, but he was still trying to fight off memories of being lost in space or getting attacked by Bismuth or Jasper corrupting while refusing his help, and then he was trying to ground himself again, knowing where this was going, knowing that he didn't know how to do the problem because he'd been breathing and counting to 10 when the teacher explained the instructions, and now it was time to turn in the assignment, and all he had done is write his name, and now he knew he'd fail the assignment, fail the class, fail the whole grade, flunk out of school and have to live with the gems for the rest of his life because he was so messed up that he couldn't focus on doing anything except not panic, and he couldn't even do that right because now he was shaking and tearing up the corner of his paper and struggling not to burst into tears because everything was hopeless and he could never get this right and the assignment was too hard and he was about to start crying in the middle of class and he should have died during his birth instead of his mother and... Stephen? He was electrified by the teacher's whisper. Mr. Morris was beside him, the other kids finished assignments in the bend of his elbow, looking down at his blank sheet and then up at him again. Stephen felt his face reddening in embarrassment and frustration, shifting and glancing down away from him. He knew what he must look like. And out of the corner of his eye, he could see that the rest of the class was watching him too, though many of them were pretending not to. He was making a scene. He was failing. "Do you need to go see the counselor?" Mr. Morris asked in a low voice, trying not to draw more attention to him. Stephen nodded shamefully. At least he'd be able to escape this nightmare for a few minutes. The counselor was named Miss Dove, and Stephen would come to see her many unfortunate times throughout the year. She didn't know him as extensively as Miss Ragoose, but she was usually good enough to calm him down until he was functional in class again. She'd ask him what was wrong, Stephen would explain, and she would listen even though she had no idea what he was talking about with inherited intergalactic wars and corrupted monster fights and human zoos and shard fusion experiments. She helped the best that she could, though. Miss Dove acted as a band-aid, a non-permanent but still useful solution. She was able to help with his schedule and would prompt him to go to tutorials whenever he didn't understand the material the first time. His dad asked frequently if he was able to handle school and if they needed to wait a few more years, but Stephen insisted that it was okay. He didn't want to delay his human life any longer, and besides, he didn't want to lose track of Emma. He might not find another friend if he tried again later. Other than just passing his classes, the stress from school was generated mostly by the other students. As the first few weeks of school went past, he began to learn his place in their social groups, far away from everyone else, but not too far to not gawk at. He began to put together why kids were missing from class. They weren't missing, they were having their schedules moved around so they'd be able to get out of being in the same class as him. They were avoiding him. He only realized this whenever a partnering project began in science, and the other kids pretended that he wasn't there, shuffling away whenever he approached. Eventually he was paired with the teacher, but not before he realized that was why so many of them were disappearing. They didn't want to be around him. He couldn't blame them. He wouldn't. But that didn't mean that it didn't hurt anyway. Emma helped a lot, but Emma wasn't always there. Devin kept trying to pick fights, and Stephen didn't know how to get him to stop before he gets hurt. Almost everyone kept their distance, and Stephen just tried to keep his head down and plow on. At least he was able to come back home to a family. No matter what happened at school, at least his dad and the crystal gems and Connie would be waiting for him. And slowly, day by day, the year went on. Stephen made it. He passed 9th grade. Barely, but that was enough for him. Stephen's scars lessened, slower than before, but still consistent. His school life was rough, but Stephen figured that he could take it. He'd saved the universe, after all. Surely he could handle this. 10th grade passed, then 11th, then 12th. And he made it. He couldn't believe it himself, but he made it. Steven Universe was finally on the path to being human. Stephen was driving away from Beach City. He couldn't believe that this was happening for 1,000 different reasons. For one, he'd never imagined regaining enough of his body from the corruption scars to be able to drive at all. For another, it seemed impossible until now that he'd ever be able to move on in life, away from Beach City, towards a college, towards a future. He was really doing it. It was almost scary. He squeezed the steering wheel of the Dondai, trying to reassure himself. This is what he wanted. He'd be happy. But still, he couldn't stop looking back at the right window, across the land at Beach City's lights. They twinkled at him like stars. The view was beautiful and sad, dark violet and silvery blue from the sleeping sun. He could see the temple from here, perched on the tip of the city's peninsula. The crater where Peridot's ship had crashed was still scarring the side of the cliff. Grass had grown over the chunk of exploded dirt, but the indent was going to remain forever. The giant looming ruins of the obsidian statues sat there pensively, the head still smashed in, but the multiple arms spread in a strong, welcoming gesture, even though many of its hands were lying half-buried in the sand below. And near the navel, nestled into the carved stone, his home. Not anymore. Stephen felt a painful twinge in his throat, blinking rapidly. Eyes on the road, Stephen. Even though his gaze was down to the yellow dashes and paved paths of asphalt, Stephen's mind was still buzzing with memories. Bad ones and good ones. All in Beach City. The first time he summoned his shield, standing in the kitchen and singing some silly jingle from an ice cream commercial. Releasing lapis from the mirror out on the beach late at night. Fusing to become Stevani for the first time on that very same beach. Showing Peridot rain. Bringing bismuth back. Ruby proposing to Sapphire. Playing with Amethyst, learning from Pearl, being comforted by Garnet. Sword training with Connie. Jam buds. He was driving away from his home, the place that he'd grown up in, a place that he'd protected and lost and then won back. He could finally escape the seaside town. He'd been released of his service to them. Free to go be human. Even though this is what he wanted, he still felt the expected magnetic pull of home trying to get him to change his mind. Stephen watched the rear-view mirror, watching his dad, Garnet, Amethyst, Pearl, Lapis, Bismuth, Peridot, Lars, Sadie, everyone he'd ever known, all of them disappearing from view. The trees and mountains obscured the town's starry light one by one, like they were being extinguished, crawling up the peninsula towards the temple, his home. He took in a breath, held it, and watched Beach City and everything that he'd ever known slip out of his sight for good. He let the breath out. He reminded himself not to think that way. They weren't gone forever, and neither was he. He wasn't ending an old life. He was starting a new one. He was free. He'd missed them a whole lot, but that was okay. Stephen was ready to go be human.